For the last part of the evening, it's going to be the stage for OMA in collaboration with Prada. I mean, here we have two giants in their own profession, in their own discipline. I think they're almost a discipline in themselves. It's a collaboration that's been going on for more than 10 years already. It started out with a casual meeting between Miucci Prada and Rem Koolhaas, and of course soon afterwards there was the first shop, and now we have seen different shops, presentations, I think even a small furniture line, and of course the Transformer Pavilion, which is traveling the world. The stage will be for Ippolito Pestellini, who has been working for 7 years now with AMO OMA, and who is responsible for all the projects concerning Prada. And he will take us through, I think, one of the most stunning collaborations between architects, interior designers, and fashion, and the world of fashion, and a fashion house, and how that collaborates. May I ask, please, a warm welcome for a very special guest with a very special story, Mr. Ippolito Pestellini. Please, the floor is yours.
Hello. I would like to start with some observation about the current status of luxury or fashion shows. When I started to work for OMA and for OMA with Prada or for Prada, I was struck by very old images like this ones. This is a Coco Chanel fashion show in 1971, and I was struck by the intimacy of the experience and the informality, something that is probably kind of disappearing at the moment. This is sort of, the first observation is this, basically, from this informal kind of moments or presentation of products, we are kind of inevitably moving towards an extremely monumental way of presenting fashions. So, such as, for example, this, which is kind of represented by this sort of a huge show in Paris last year. This is quite interesting. It's the same brand. Of course, many years have passed, but you see there is no kind of intimacy between the product and the audience. And I always wonder when I see these kind of shows, what is the kind of product feeling that the people have about when they basically attend such an event of this size. This is purely a theatrical experience that doesn't really have a lot to do with the industry itself. And we are very interested in the industry and in presentation of products. Obviously, things like this happens not only to fashion, but the need of monumentality seems to be basically a need common to many visual and many fields. The second preoccupation, or the second kind of observation, is the relationship between image and product. This is a very interesting image from a side catwalk fashion show from Galeries Lafayette, and you see how close the people are. I'm sorry. How close the people are to the fashion. The level of scenography is minimal. The center is the fashion somehow. And obviously this is reflected in the way the products were presented, for example, in shopping windows, a very clear definition between backgrounds and foreground. Everything is very sophisticated, everything is theatrical, but there is no confusion between the two. While the same confusion is something that I feel somehow there is in many kind of fashion representation of today's. This is a LVMH fashion show made in collaboration with Daniel Buren. There is obviously a direct relationship between the fashion and the stage, which turns somehow into shopping windows of this kind, where seemingly there is basically no difference between background and foreground. And obviously there is a very strong coherency between product and stage, but at the same time, the kind of quality of the product seems not to be really standing out. It seems that it's not so important anymore. The following preoccupation, or the kind of observation, is the relationship between challenge and reinforcement. It's an interesting question because the way we approach brand is really on this thin line. Somehow the reinforcement of a brand or their brand identity comes through, at least for us, a challenging of their values, or somehow we tend to try to bring them outside of their familiar territories. And this is the way I think it's the best way to represent or to talk about the relationship between Oma, Amo, or whatever, with Prada. There is a sort of collaboration, and that's why we always tend to identify this kind of this relationship with and for Prada. We work with Prada, we work for Prada at the same time. Everything started, was said before, approximately 14 years ago, and the collaboration needs to be explained by the meeting of two creative minds. And somehow it seems to be pretentious, maybe saying it after 14 years and considering the size that our office now has reached and probably Prada has reached. But at the time, the initial collaboration was simply an open debate, an open dialogue between creative people. They wanted simply to investigate new ways, both in architecture and in fashion or retail. And what is crucial about this image, I think, is that by only knowing the creative mind of a company like this one, that is basically, whose ideas are the manifestation of everything that Prada produces, is the only way somehow to really approach the brand, knowing her history, her political taste, her cultural tendencies, and so on. As you know, Prada normally has a mainstream representation that is somehow similar to these kind of campaigns that are always kind of diverse. But at the same time, this is not the domain where we kind of collaborate. We collaborate more into a sort of more challenging kind of area. So these are the images that we are used to when we work with them. In the first moments of the collaboration, we were sort of asked to investigate the brand, and in order to investigate the brand, we tried to produce a series of exercises of anti-brand, therefore challenging the brand and bringing the brand to some less familiar territories. So we sort of tried to brand fakes, for example. We created a phone, this was already 10 years ago, and if you have in mind the LG phone by Prada, this is of course something completely different. Or we branded the taste of Miuccia herself. This is a screenshot from one very famous movie by Pasolini, and we sort of thought, okay, if that's what it's a favorite movie of the creative mind of this company, can this be branded as Prada, for example? The sort of visual exercises of this kind continued, trying to even move into sort of outrageous messages that were kind of unfamiliar for the company when we started to produce them. And as you see, this is something for a kind of luxury brand at the time was kind of strange in a way, but they sort of like it to the point that in some cases they also implement this kind of visual exercises into sort of a temporary collection or launches of products like t-shirts. The image that you saw before was belonged to a sequence, a line of t-shirts that was called Prada Classics. In a way, there was an anticipation of this project just before I started my talk. This anti kind of attitude began especially, manifested itself especially in the production of the first the only retail project that we did for Prada. One is, of course, the Epicenter in New York. There is a project, it's basically a store that is not meant necessarily to sell. It's meant, or it was understood as a sort of a brand making machine. In a way, the possibility to turn this big curve into a temporary stage was meant to host cultural events with the aim to promote the aura or the image of the brand. In LA, that is the second project that we did for them. Of course, the situation was completely different. It's a project that, against all kind of dogmas of the retail design, when it's closed, it doesn't have a facade. So there is no transparency, nothing. And this, of course, unlocked the possibility to infiltrate products in more surprising ways. In this particular case, underground, with this kind of holes looking into the floor. What is the base of our collaboration? And it's actually probably the core of our ongoing collaboration. It's our work on their design of their fashion shows. And we began 10 years ago. I've been working on fashion shows specifically in the past 7 years, so since I joined the company. And in a way, for the phase that I experienced, in the phase that I experienced, the idea was somehow to try to understand how to change the rule of the game. As you know, a fashion show, except especially like luxury brand fashion show, happens normally in a straight line. And you have two wings of public on two sides. And the first phase of shows that we worked on were actually based on distorting this linearity of the catwalk. And by distorting it, modulating the crowd in different ways around the fashion experience, around the products. So in this case, for example, the models were coming from the top and they were hitting a sort of circular kind of plateau where the audience was sitting. In another case, we created a sort of archipelago, so the line was completely deconstructed and very sinuous, so that the experience was at the same time open, or here you see the islands. It was basically made of wooden islands scattered along this industrial room. And then basically the models were kind of weaving around in multiple directions, so that the experience could be somehow both open and intimate at the same time. It happens very often then we have a very osmotic kind of collaboration. So during the fashion shows, we sort of talk constantly with their creative team. And what happens normally is that there is a lot of exchange. So things that are maybe refused by the collection or by the process of making the clothes are maybe end up in the space, and vice versa. So in this case, for example, the graphics that we developed, these very basic graphics that we developed, it was an archipelago, so we sort of draw fishes and mermaids and so on. They ended up eventually in some clothing, really last minute. It happens without almost like realizing it. But I think this gives a degree of the exchange between the two companies, which is, the exchange is open and the dialogue is always very frank. Another show, a completely different special ideas. This was a kind of arena that obviously had a completely different kind of experience. All the audience was looking into one point or from multiple levels, realized through a scaffold. And sometimes we exchanged sort of these references, very often from movies. The idea was to recreate a form of a Thunderdome, a sort of a fighting arena. Here you see Tina Turner in her beautiful outfits. The second phase, somehow I could trace back like all the projects that we work on, and there are probably three phases that we can identify. One was geometric, the one where we actually distorted and created different kind of spaces to modulate the audience around it, around the fashion experience, around the presentation of the product. The second one is probably political in a way, where we really engage with the understanding of whether we could really change the rules of the game, i.e. also changing the rules that are related to the organization in first of audience according to rows. So the most important people go first, the least important people, they stand on the back of the show. So in this case, between cruelty and irony, we put the least important people outside, so they could only see the show through a slot. There was, of course, a commentary to the whole freakness of the fashion world. And in another case, we sort of spread 600 seats across the room where Prada normally organizes its own fashion shows. And therefore, this kind of perfect geometrical order destroyed any kind of hierarchy. You know, this is a kind of the most democratic setup for a fashion show that you can somehow get. And the perfect geometrical order ended up in a sort of quite free organization of the audience. The audience could move around, which is actually something that normally doesn't happen. And the models were sort of released in space very freely, so freely that during the test, they were so confused that we had to draw arrows for them. They were getting lost. I mean, it happens. It happens. The last phase is probably what we call theatrical, and that's why we started with these kind of preoccupations, because everything is getting more and more theatrical. The focus is not really on the collection, but the focus is actually on the context where the collection is presented. I don't say this out of any polemic kind of argument, but at the same time, there is, of course, a tendency in that direction, which is not focusing on contents. And contents in this case are, of course, it's clothing, obviously. So the first show that we did that was blatantly about creating a context was this kind of wall that was representing a sequences of corridors that were simply changing through projection. So it was a kind of fixed surface and they were changing, and then So they were representing kind of corridors, imaginary corridors normally, and the collection was sort of adapting to the different kind of scenarios that we gave them as backgrounds. Sometimes, of course, the setup or the scenography can be extremely minimal. This was a show inspired by science fiction references, and therefore just a light of beam was enough, and a completely white neutral space was enough to sort of give context to fashion. And sometimes instead, and this is actually really proper of the latest phase of the collaboration in fashion show stage set design, the theatrical component is sort of taking over almost. So that we're also testing ourselves in things that we never did before. I.e., in this case, where we wanted to represent a sort of bourgeois interior house, a continuous sort of interior landscape, the idea that Miuccia Prada had for this was a men fashion show, was basically a man moving through a kind of bourgeois, timeless interior. So we had to create a kind of genealogy, instant genealogy of furniture, abstract furniture. And this is how it ended up to be. So in a way, it almost looks really like a set with the furnitures, props that we also kind of design, and a sequences of projections that were inspired by movies where the bourgeoisie is normally represented, like from Antonioni to Godard, which we use to collage and create the windows on which this kind of imaginary interior was opening into. So this is it was a purely theatrical experience for us. Less about space, less about the kind of physical, spatial experience of the show, less about intimacy, but definitely about the experience of almost a performance. This is another one. It was representing a kind of a sort of a palace of power inspired by a Soviet project. So we had a kind of huge carpet and these elements of light resembling almost like 1960s Soviet chandeliers. And I want to use this project to also show you a bit how we work. Normally, parallelly to what we do in the stage set design, we are also present very much into backstage and in the making of the collection. We document the process. We sort of make it our own. It's a good way to also understand how the process of fashion goes and moves. So, for example, we take pictures during the make of the clothing, which, trust me, happens until the very last minute before the show. Whatever you see here, it's assembled in 24 hours. The only thing that they have ready are maybe some prints. And there is like a group of 60 people working on the clothes that we sort of see until the very last minute before the show. These images are then post-produced into a product we call lookbook, and that the lookbook is basically a sort of enhancement of the ideas that we have shared during the collection, during the making of the stage set, and that are mixed or turned into graphics somehow in order to present the concept of the collection in a stronger way. In this case, this was the show of the archipelago that had obvious classics references, so mythology, in a way, classicism was the key. Or this was the show, actually, the big carpet that was about power. It was a sort of timeless power. And lately, we turned this project into a sort of video, again, testing ourselves beyond the limits of an architecture office, because we never did proper videos before, so this is really basic compared to your stuff. But we do green screen sessions after the shows in order to basically, we use the models as actors, and somehow the lookbook that used to be a printed document becomes a video, and the video is available on their website. And it's obviously, the good thing about not being specialist is that they can allow you to be extremely primitive and simple. But normally we think that this is actually a quality in a way, in a world where everything is super smooth, super refined. So we bring a bit of primitiveness or brutality to their productions, which are normally very, very sophisticated. So obviously the show was about power, so we sort of represented power in very ironic ways. I will spare you the whole video. Another domain of investigation with Prada is basically the design of social events, or social stages, as we call them. This was an event that we designed in Valencia for the Louis Vuitton Cup. They sort of rented this huge space, this huge street market. And of course, the question here was, okay, how do we enter into such a space without compromising its qualities? Because normally, you know, fashion brands, they enter and they sort of colonize everything, they sort of make everything their own. So what we did was a kind of a very careful mapping of all the programs that we needed, all the kind of food stalls that we needed to use. We asked the owners whether we could use them. So we sort of put DJ booths or presentation or food booths. They were kind of mixed with the stalls of the existing market. Wherever we didn't get permission, we sort of projected an image, so to represent basically what was closed. And the products were sort of scattered around. So close to cheese and ham, you would find some kind of Prada products. And obviously, logos are normally untouchable, but we decided to, touch the logo of Prada, sort of forcing them to sort of blend inside this kind of environment. Another event that we designed took place in this this building in Paris. It's a beautiful Auguste Perret building, and it's basically a building that is the home of one branch of the French government, the Conseil économique, social et environnemental. And there, in 2012, we installed a 24-hour museum in collaboration with an artist called Francesco Vezzoli. The idea was to sort of use the museum as an escamotage to make the place public and to sort of design a social event to stage this art, kind of art. Obviously, the whole thing was a parody, but we never unveiled that it was a parody. The idea was to basically, we built a room inside a room. The room was a sort of psychedelic version of a white cube. We colonized the rest of the ground floor, such as the parliament where normally laws are voted by representatives of different parties. And then the box was sort of supporting different kind of stages of this 24 hours, so different kind of social events, a private dinner. And normally when you design an event of this kind, you almost design the social behaviors of people. So for example, we let people in, also the people who were not invited to the dinner, so they would starve outside of the cage. Then we, of course, let everybody in for a big party. And the day after, somehow, the museum was open, but we never unveiled that it was a parody. So people were coming in, we were giving tours, somehow, of this art in the shape of a real museum, so museum tours like this with proper guides. But, of course, nothing was real. The idea was to make this building public, really public, for 24 hours. This space is also where we designed the fashion shows for Miu Miu. Normally they have different kind of premises. They are really special interpretation of this fantastic monumental architecture by Auguste Perret. So either floating platforms on multiple levels or a cut in the middle of the space that, of course, generate completely different experiences of that space. We skip through. Close to basically the collaboration with fashion, there is a collaboration also with the other side of Prada, that is the Prada Foundation. And the work, I'm going to, if I have time, present 2 projects. 3 minutes? 4 minutes? Okay. The first project that I'm going to show you is basically this exhibition on Auguste Perret, so the author of the building that I was showing you before. After we worked few seasons in the same place, a sort of designing installation which were interpretation of the same space, we had the luck to be asked to design an exhibition about this very famous French architect. What we did was an intelligent reuse, or supposedly intelligent reuse, of 2 previous installations. Time was very limited, of course. So on one side, the 24 hours museum, and on the other side, the show that I was mentioning before. And the 2 things were sort of adapted to the contents of the exhibition. On one side, the cage served as a presentation display of a very archival scientific research material about 8 main buildings of Auguste Perret, 8 masterpieces. The central band was basically used to display biography, while the wood, here you see the cage, and the presentation of these archival materials, such as drawings or models. It's not, yeah. While the wood part was actually about the current status of the building, the life in the building, so it was a collection of supports for activities, such as videos, or a display for objects or relics from the buildings that we were showing on the other half. So a very clear scheme in a way. I would like to close with this, which is a very important project for us. It's also another exhibition that we design in Venice, in the Venetian location of the Prada Foundation. The exhibition was basically restaging a very crucial project curated by Harold Zeman in 1969 in Bern that was called When Attitude Becomes Form. It was a unique exhibition where several artists from a very avant-garde-ish generation from the late 60s, they were sort of called in order to install on-site specifically produced art pieces. So it was an exhibition virtually impossible to replicate because it was basically meant for a one-off. And of course, there was a kind of representatives of landscape art or arte povera or conceptual art. It was almost like a manifesto. These are pictures from the existing, from the original exhibition. In 2013, we were asked to restage this project, this exhibition. We took the exercise very literally. We sort of noticed there was a correspondence, one-to-one, between the plan of the Fondazione Prada in Venice and the plan of the original building, and we decided simply to build it up, to rebuild the original installation on top or inside the building in Venice. So to do this, we sort of deconstructed the pictures, archival pictures from the original exhibitions, and we reinstall exactly the same layout. With the consequence though, and here you see comparison between the original exhibition and of course the reenactment, with the consequence though that of course the combination of the two spaces was kind of generated surprising situations, both for the audience and for the art. So the final result was not really a reconstruction of the old and not really basically a sort of reenactment. It was simply a stage where the art pieces were kind of floating in limbo between the old space, the original space in Bern, and the Baroque building in Venice. I guess I don't have any more time. Okay.
Thank you, Ippolito. Yes, I'm sorry, it is 90 minutes of frame and not 91. I have a question. Somewhere in your presentation, you said the focus is not on the collection, but on the presentation, the context, so to say. We're talking about AMO OMA here. Was there no interference with the fashion designers at all?
There is, of course.
Ah, okay.
No. It's maybe it's something that there is a very osmotic kind of dialogue between us and the fashion designer, to the point that there are contents that are exchanged between the stage set design and the collection. It happens very often.
Okay, so you get to see the collection first and then...
No, we don't see the collection first. We only see bits and pieces of the process.
So you make the staging of the shows
without seeing the collection. The collection starts in the same moment that we start to design and propose the stage design. So it's a totally parallel creative process.
Aha. Well, parallel, I would say separate almost.
No, it's parallel. It's also separate.
Okay.
Now, obviously, there are
in the same direction.
There are obviously points of contact, but normally, and I think it's actually right, we only exchange vague ideas or concepts about the collection. We see bits and pieces. Maybe we see some patterns. Maybe we see some reference images, like the Tina Turner image that I was showing before. Yeah. But never the collection in its full. It's also because it's finished really in the same moment that the stage is finished.
Mm-hmm. Yes, of course. But if you have to go straight parallel, as you said, that means that you both have to know exactly where you're going. That also means, and I think that's the whole idea of the collaboration, is that you have to know exactly what Prada is, what the brand stands for, what the image is, what the identity is. Well, we've seen how you've described it in staging. Can you describe it for us in a few sentences? What Prada is, what it stands for. A few sentences. 90 minutes, huh?
Yeah. It's I wouldn't know how to answer to this question, because what is Prada is, it's a kind of differently maybe from other brands that have like a more straightforward identity. Prada is a collage of different identities. In every show, you saw also the diversity of the shows. It's new. It's a new invention. It's a new process, and so on. If there is an identity, it's in the method of collaging contents, collaging references, collaging visuals, and so on. Maybe the method is more in the kind of way to identify an identity for Prada. It's fun enough because it's the same thing that you could say, for example, about OMA. There is not really like a very predetermined language. Every project is different. In the same way, Prada operates very similarly, I would say.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ippolito. Can I ask you please to stay on the stage for 1 second? And I'd like to invite all the guests of the evening. Nick, Peter, Jolan, please, can I invite you on the stage? And ask for a big, warm applause for these guests who made our evening.